A 26-year-old fool is about to destroy the most powerful army in Japan with just 2,000 men. Everyone thinks he's insane. They're about to find out he's a genius. June 1560. Oda Nobunaga stands in the rain, staring at an impossible choice. Marching toward him is the largest army Japan has ever seen, 25,000 warriors, led by the most powerful lord in the country. Logic says surrender. Honor says fight and die. But Nobunaga has a third option that will either make him a legend or ensure he's remembered as history's greatest fool. But first, you need to understand the monster he's facing. Imagawa Yoshimoto wasn't just any warlord. This was the man everyone expected to become Japan's next ruler. He controlled 3 entire provinces and commanded loyalty from the most elite warriors in the land. His army wasn't a collection of peasant conscripts. These were professional soldiers, disciplined troops who had crushed every enemy they'd ever faced. Yoshimoto's reputation had been built on decades of victories. He had shattered the Matsudaira clan and forced them into submission. He had broken the warrior monks of Mikawa province, who thought their temples made them invincible. Every battle he fought ended the same way, with enemy banners trampled in the mud and their leaders begging for mercy he rarely granted. His very name struck fear across Japan, because when Yoshimoto marched to war, defeat wasn't just likely, it was inevitable. Through his bloodline, Yoshimoto could claim direct descent from the shogun dynasties that had ruled Japan for centuries. In his mind, he wasn't conquering, he was reclaiming what belonged to him by right. His march on the imperial capital had been years in the making, built on careful alliances and strategic marriages that stretched across central Japan. The current shogun was weak, a puppet controlled by others, and Yoshimoto saw himself as the man destined to restore the shogunate to its former glory. As this magnificent force moved north, their banners glinting in the summer sun, victory seemed inevitable. The great lords were already calculating how to curry favor with Japan's future ruler. But what none of them understood was that the greatest threat to their ambitions wasn't another army. If you want to see how this impossible battle changed Japanese history forever, hit that subscribe button now, because this story gets absolutely insane. It was a single castle defended by a man his own people called the Great Fool of Owari. To understand why nobody took Nobunaga seriously, picture everything a proper Japanese lord was supposed to be, then imagine the complete opposite. While other daimyo conducted themselves with ancient dignity, Nobunaga paraded through his towns dressed like a peasant, his hair in bizarre styles, treating merchants and commoners as equals. The stories of his outrageous behavior were legendary across Japan. He had been seen dancing in the streets during festivals, not the formal ceremonial dances of the nobility, but wild, improper movements that scandalized onlookers. He wore foreign clothes brought by Portuguese traders, bright colors, and strange cuts that violated every principle of proper dress. At formal ceremonies, he would arrive late, inappropriately dressed, sometimes carrying a rifle instead of the traditional swords that marked his rank. His own retainers whispered he'd lost his mind. He practiced with firearms, weapons, traditional samurai considered dishonorable. He promoted men based on ability rather than birth, elevating peasants over ancient warrior families. He showed open contempt for Buddhist monks and ignored every ceremony that was supposed to govern a lord's behavior. When his father died, many predicted Nobunaga would destroy the Oda clan within years through his reckless disregard for tradition. But here's what everyone missed. Beneath that outrageous behavior was a mind that saw warfare completely differently than anyone else in Japan. Those dishonored firearms? They could cut down master swordsmen before they drew their blades. Those peasant foot soldiers, they could be forged into disciplined units that wouldn't break under pressure. While other lords clung to tactics that were centuries old, Nobunaga was revolutionizing the art of war itself. His innovations went far beyond weapons. He had studied the Portuguese traders and learned about European military organization. He implemented new training methods that turned farmers into soldiers faster than traditional methods could produce samurai. He established supply lines that could feed armies in the field for months, while his enemies still relied on seasonal campaigns that ended when the rice harvest began. When news arrived that Yoshimoto's vast army was marching north, Nobunaga's advisors begged him to surrender immediately. The math was brutal. 25,000 against 2,000. No sane general fights those odds. But what happened next would prove that sanity is overrated. While his council urged surrender, Nobunaga was planning something no rational person would attempt, and the weather gods were about to give him the perfect opportunity. June 12th dawned grey and humid, with storm clouds building on the horizon. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Experienced warriors recognized the signs. A major storm was coming, the kind that would turn roads into rivers and make movement nearly impossible. For most armies, this would mean seeking shelter and waiting for better conditions. As Yoshimoto's massive force settled into their camps, confident victory was hours away. Nobunaga gathered his tiny force in his castle courtyard. What he told them became the stuff of legend. But first, he did something that revealed the depth of his desperation or his faith, depending on how you looked at it. According to historical records, Nobunaga first traveled to the sacred Atsuta shrine to pray for divine favor. This wasn't the quick ritual blessing most warriors performed before battle. He spent hours in meditation, kneeling before the altar dedicated to the sun goddess Amaterasu, the divine ancestor of the imperial line. Witnesses said he emerged from the shrine transformed, as if something fundamental had changed in his very soul. When he emerged, witnesses said his face had completely changed. The foolish young lord was gone. In his place stood something harder, more focused, infinitely more dangerous. The man who had scandalized society with his bizarre behavior now radiated the kind of presence that made hardened warriors step back instinctively. His speech was brief and electric. They were outnumbered more than 10 to 1. The enemy was stronger, better equipped, commanded by a general who'd never known defeat. Logic said they'd all be dead before sunset. But logic was for men who thought like their grandfathers. Today, they would do something that would either make them legends or ensure their deaths had meaning. He told them they weren't just fighting for Owari province or even for their own lives. They were fighting for the future of Japan itself. Yoshimoto represented the old way, where birth mattered more than ability, where tradition stifled innovation, where the strong crushed the weak simply because they could. If he won today, that world would continue for another generation. But if they could achieve the impossible, if they could prove that courage and innovation could triumph over mere numbers, they would change Japan forever. Then he revealed a plan so audacious it took their breath away. But you'll have to wait to hear it, because first we need to see what their target was doing. Yoshimoto was making the kind of mistake that only comes from absolute confidence. Rather than pressing his advantage immediately, he'd allowed his army to spread across the countryside. His main force was camped in the narrow gorge of Okehazama, packed together in what should have been a defensive position but was about to become a trap. The gorge itself was a natural bottleneck, surrounded by heavily forested hills that provided excellent cover for anyone approaching unseen. Yoshimoto had chosen it because it offered good defensive positions and clear sightlines in multiple directions. His scouts controlled the high ground, his archers had perfect fields of fire, and the narrow entrance meant any attacking force would be channeled into a killing ground. It should have been impregnable. More critically, Yoshimoto himself was celebrating. Historical accounts describe him composing poetry and enjoying sake with his senior retainers, utterly confident the young fool nearby would surrender without a fight. His scouts had reported Nobunaga's pathetic numbers. The outcome was so certain that Yoshimoto was already planning his triumphal entry into the capital. The scene in Yoshimoto's camp was one of complete confidence bordering on arrogance. His commanders joked about how quickly they would crush the Oda forces. Some wagered on whether Nobunaga would surrender before the first arrow was fired, or wait until he saw the full might of the Imagawa army deployed against him. Wine flowed freely, and the atmosphere was more like a victory celebration than a military preparation. The irony was perfect. The most powerful army in Japan, led by a man who considered himself the next shogun, was about to be caught completely off guard by the very enemy they dismissed as harmless. And that's when Nobunaga revealed his insane plan. While Yoshimoto's army celebrated their inevitable victory, Nobunaga would take his entire force and strike directly at Yoshimoto himself. Not his flanks, not his supply lines, but straight at the heart of the army. Kill the head, and the body would die. It was a strategy that violated every principle of military wisdom. Conventional tactics called for wearing down a superior enemy, attacking their weakest points, avoiding their strengths. Nobunaga was proposing to do exactly the opposite. The plan required perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and a level of coordination that would be challenging even for veteran troops. They would have to march several miles through difficult terrain, avoid detection by enemy scouts, position themselves for a surprise attack, and then execute a perfect assault against a force more than 10 times their size. Any mistake, any delay, any moment of hesitation would mean annihilation. His men listened in stunned silence. It was suicide. It was insanity. It was exactly the kind of impossible gamble that had earned him his reputation. But as they looked into their lord's eyes, they saw something that made them believe the impossible might just be possible. And as the first raindrops began to fall, something extraordinary was about to happen. The weather gods seemed to be choosing sides. As Nobunaga's small force moved out, a massive thunderstorm began building over the countryside. The same storm that would make their march miserable might also provide perfect cover for the impossible. The wind picked up, bending trees and sending clouds racing across the sky. Lightning flickered in the distance, and the rumble of thunder grew steadily louder. For Nobunaga, the approaching storm was a gift from heaven. The rain would muffle the sound of their movement. The wind would carry away any sense that might alert enemy scouts, and the lightning would mask any glimpses of their force moving through the forests. But it would also make their approach a nightmare of mud, slippery rocks, and limited visibility. Through sheets of rain and rolling thunder, death was coming for the most powerful man in Japan. What happened next changed everything, and it happened faster than anyone thought possible. The approach march became a nightmare of mud and rain. Nobunaga's 2,000 warriors slogged through rice paddies and mountain paths, their weapons slick, their armor weighing them down. Every step was treacherous, every breath labored. The rain soaked through their clothing and ran in rivers off their armor. The mud sucked at their feet, threatening to trap them with every stride. But that miserable storm was also their salvation. Thunder masked their movement, drowning out the clink of armor and weapons that would normally betray a force this size. Rain kept enemy scouts huddled in shelter, unwilling to venture out into the downpour to maintain their watch. The very conditions that made their advance agony also made it possible. Nobunaga himself led from the front, his war fan clutched in his hand, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. He knew that every minute they delayed increased the chance of discovery. His men could see their lord's determination, and it sustained them through the brutal march. When soldiers stumbled in the mud, their comrades helped them up without a word. When equipment was lost in the darkness, they shared what they had. As they crept closer to Okehazama Gorge, they could see smoke from countless campfires rising through the rain. Yoshimoto's army was packed exactly where Nobunaga needed them. The terrain that should have been their advantage was about to become a death trap. Through the storm, they could hear the sounds of celebration, laughter, and music drifting from the enemy camp. The contrast was stark. While Yoshimoto's men feasted, Nobunaga's soldiers prepared for the most desperate gamble in Japanese military history. At 2 p.m., just as the storm reached peak intensity, Nobunaga's voice cut through the thunder with a war cry that would echo through history. Eiraku Futsuju, eternal glory to the realm. 2,000 warriors erupted from the forest like a human avalanche, crashing into Yoshimoto's unprepared forces with devastating effect. The surprise was absolute. Most of Yoshimoto's men were sheltering from rain, weapons set aside, guard completely down. In heartbeats, disciplined troops became a panicked mob. The impact of the charge was devastating beyond anything anyone had imagined. Nobunaga's warriors, driven by desperation and their lord's unshakable will, struck with the force of men who knew they were fighting for more than their lives. They were fighting for history itself. The first ranks of Yoshimoto's army simply disintegrated under the assault, seasoned warriors cut down before they could even understand what was happening. Nobunaga himself led the charge, cutting straight toward Yoshimoto's banner. This wasn't careful samurai maneuvering. This was controlled violence, fast and brutal and decisive. His war fan became a weapon as he directed his forces with surgical precision, sending units to exploit weaknesses the moment they appeared, maintaining the momentum that was their only hope of survival. The sound was indescribable, the clash of steel on steel mixed with the screams of wounded men and the roar of the storm overhead. Rain turned the ground to bloody mud, making footing treacherous for both sides. But Nobunaga's men had expected this chaos, had prepared for it, while Yoshimoto's forces were caught completely unprepared. But here's the moment that changed everything. Yoshimoto, roused from his poetry by screams and clashing steel, barely had time to understand what was happening. His bodyguards tried forming a protective circle, but Nobunaga's warriors smashed through them like a tsunami through a seawall. In the chaos and rain, with attackers seeming to come from everywhere, the invincible army collapsed into complete disorder. The great lord himself fought with the skill that had made his reputation, his sword flashing in deadly arcs as he tried to rally his men. For a moment, it seemed his personal prowess might turn the tide, his very presence inspiring his bodyguards to fight with renewed fury. But the momentum was unstoppable, and the circle around him grew smaller with each passing second. When low-ranking soldiers Mori Shinsuke and Hattori Koheta fought their way to Yoshimoto himself, the great lord drew his sword and fought with a master's skill, but he was overwhelmed. The two Ashigaru, common foot soldiers, who in any other circumstance would have been beneath Yoshimoto's notice, had become the instruments of destiny. The moment of Yoshimoto's death was almost anticlimactic after the chaos that preceded it. One moment he was fighting desperately, the next he lay still in the mud, his blood mixing with the rain. When Yoshimoto fell, struck down in hand-to-hand combat, his death cry cut through the storm like a bell tolling the end of an era. Want to see more incredible stories of military genius that changed history? Hit that like button and share this with anyone who loves tales of courage against impossible odds. The taking of Yoshimoto's head sent shockwaves through his entire army. In samurai warfare, the death of the commanding general didn't just mean a change in leadership, it meant the spiritual heart of the army had been torn out. Commanders preparing for easy victory suddenly found themselves leaderless in disaster. Units that had never retreated began falling back in confusion. An organized military machine became a fleeing mob in under 2 hours. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the physical casualties. These were men who had followed Yoshimoto for years, who had come to believe in his invincibility. To see their lord struck down by peasant soldiers in a muddy gorge shattered their worldview completely. Some threw down their weapons and fled. Others stood in shock, unable to process what they had witnessed. A few tried to rally and continue the fight, but without central command, their efforts were doomed. As quickly as it began, the battle was over. Rain continued washing blood from Okehazama Gorge, but the storm had passed in more ways than one. In less than 2 hours, the most powerful army in Japan had been shattered by a fool with a dream. The immediate aftermath was surreal in its completeness. Where minutes before there had been an organized army, now there were only scattered groups of fleeing soldiers. Nobunaga's men, hardly believing their own victory, began the grim work of confirming their triumph. The head of Imagawa Yoshimoto, taken according to the customs of warfare, became the physical proof of an achievement that would have seemed impossible just hours before. The aftermath reshaped history completely. News of Yoshimoto's death sparked pure disbelief across Japan. The man destined to become shogun was dead, killed by the lord everyone had dismissed as harmless. Nobunaga, the great fool of Owari, had achieved the impossible, but the victory's true significance went far beyond a single battle. Yoshimoto's death created a power vacuum that let Nobunaga begin his methodical conquest of Japan. Former enemy clans switched sides and became allies. Lords who'd planned to join Yoshimoto's march suddenly reconsidered their positions. The young fool who'd seemed like prey was revealed as the most dangerous man in Japan. The Matsudaira clan, formerly Yoshimoto's vassals, immediately sent envoys to negotiate with Nobunaga. Other daimyo who had been preparing to march in Yoshimoto's wake suddenly found themselves isolated and vulnerable. The entire political structure of central Japan shifted overnight, creating opportunities that Nobunaga would exploit with the same ruthless efficiency he had shown at Okehazama. The victory established the pattern that would define Nobunaga's entire career. Where others followed tradition, he innovated. Where others moved cautiously, he struck with lightning speed. Where others saw impossible odds, he saw opportunity. The rain-soaked gorge where Yoshimoto died became the birthplace of unified Japan. This single battle changed the trajectory of Japanese civilization. For over a century, the country had been torn by civil war, with dozens of rival clans fighting for supremacy while the common people suffered. Nobunaga's victory at Okehazama began the process of unification that would bring peace to Japan for the first time in generations. It proved that innovation could triumph over tradition, that merit could overcome birth, and that audacity could achieve what caution never could. Within months, Nobunaga began campaigns that would make him the most powerful daimyo in the country. He would control the capital, challenge warrior monks, and systematically unify a nation torn by civil war for over a century. But it all started in that gorge, with 2,000 men charging impossible odds. The transformation of Nobunaga's reputation was immediate and total. The man who had been mocked as the great fool of Owari was suddenly recognized as a military genius. His unconventional methods, once seen as signs of madness, were now understood as innovations ahead of their time. Every daimyo in Japan had to recalculate their strategies based on this new reality. The rules of warfare had changed forever. The fool of Owari was dead. In his place stood the demon lord who would unite Japan under his iron will. If you enjoyed this incredible military upset, subscribe for more stories of the moments that changed our world. What other impossible victories would you like us to explore? Let us know in the comments, and share this with fellow history lovers who appreciate genius disguised as madness.